Welcome to another IREI Live webinar. Today's topic is ESG. In particular, we're going to be looking at how environmental and social factors of ESG, the E and the S, how those can create an enhanced value for investors. As many of you know, ESG is of increasing importance for investors, and they're keenly aware of how ESG risks may affect their investments and how addressing that can set them up for stronger returns. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this, Elion, GID, Heinz, Mosser, and Sterling Bay. Our first panel will be looking at the E of ESG, looking at how that can create a foundation of value and returns for all stakeholders. And I'd like to bring on our panelists, Phil and Adam, who will introduce themselves and share some key highlights of their experience. Starting off with Phil.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are based. My name is Phil Carmody. I'm head of ESG here at GID. GID is a privately held, vertically integrated real estate investor, operator, developer, and a fiduciary. For over 60 years, we've been focused on investing and caring for the communities in which we live and work and operate. Our portfolio currently is around $30 billion assets under management, comprised of 50,000 apartment homes and around 23 million square feet of industrial and commercial space. In my career, I've worked across the whole life cycle of real estate, from development, acquisitions, operations, and portfolio management. And it's really meaningful to see it all come together with my focus on ESG here at GID. Good to be with everybody.
And Adam.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon. So I am our Vice President of Global ESG. I actually started at Greenprint, which has formed the basis of Urban Land Institute sustainability initiatives, and have been at Heinz 10 years. Heinz is also a global investment manager with about 100 billion AUM, 7 private investment vehicles, including a REIT. We've actually been around for about 65 years, similar to GID, a little bit larger in scope and scale, across nearly 30 countries around the world. And I've spent the last 10 years at Heinz, with a good portion of that on our investment management business, and transitioned over to help run our sustainability platform a couple years ago.
Thank you. I'd like to start things off by talking about net zero. What is net zero, and what are the impacts of trying to reach net zero, and what do investors need to keep in mind as they evaluate these targets and benchmarks? And let's start with Adam, but I'll have both of you speak on this.
That's a lot of questions. So what is net zero? Let's start there.
Let's build a foundation here.
Yeah. So let's define net zero the way that Heinz talks about it, at least, and I think many of our peers and competitors in the industry, which is basically for us, it's we have a focus on net zero carbon. So we are looking at how do we achieve basically consuming enough energy, but also being able to offset that in various ways. So for us, as it relates to carbon, that's talking about green energy procurement, that's talking about on-site renewables. We recognize that, we operate buildings, we're also vertically integrated, and we're going to focus on energy efficiency, but that's one half of it, and the other half is supply. The one thing that Heinz is committed to, in addition to our net zero operational carbon target of 2040, is also not using offsets to achieve that. And I think that's something that investors need and should be thinking about as they set their own targets, is for us, as we invest in the real estate and in the capital to achieve net zero, offsets are just paying someone else to deal with your problem, basically. What we're trying to do is solve it from the ground up, building by building, across each of our funds and across our global portfolio. And then I would say too, as we look ahead into the future, we're all very focused on operating carbon, but Heinz is aligned with a scientific-based targets initiative, SBTI, and we know in the next year, maybe two, that they will also have an embodied carbon target. And I have no doubt that we as a firm will continue to latch onto that as part of our own journey to net zero carbon. And so we'll be focused not only on the embodied carbon and achieving net zero there, but also getting to a much lower embodied carbon target over the next couple decades as well.
And Phil, can you talk a little bit about net zero and what are some of the impacts of trying to reach it?
Sure. So it's not simple. And so in looking at the pathway to net zero, we realize it isn't just one specific action. And you're going to hear this a little bit of a theme throughout today. It isn't just one thing that's going to get us there. So we really break it down and starting to look on our journey at the asset level and really understanding the assets and their current own individual footprint is really important. And that's quite difficult to get to with access to information. So we're leveraging technologies to better understand our assets and what is driving the carbon emissions at each of our assets across the portfolio, and then really making those first step incremental changes to lowering emissions. So whether it's behavioral change through tenant and resident engagement to lower emissions, to looking at efficiency of the equipment we have and whether we can make change to the existing equipment or you need to make a longer term plan to change equipment out. And then also, building that into the development infrastructure, as Adam has been talking about already, and we'll get into that a bit more. How do you electrify a building? How do you build that resiliency into the future plan too? So, but you have to start with understanding your building and measuring where you currently are and figuring out what your baseline is and where you start from to figure out where you need to go.
Thank you. I think, for an investor, one of the questions they might ask is why? And I think there's a pretty good answer of why try to achieve net zero, but there are financial implications for that. So, is it possible to achieve net zero carbon today? What are the financial implications and what should investors know about this? I'm going to start with you, Adam, again.
Yeah, the why is an expansive question as well, because it's not just doing the right thing, it's getting ahead of regulations, it's brand and reputation, it is creating value. Can you get to net zero today? You can, and it's going to cost a good amount of money as well. And I think all that goes into, we take an investor's perspective when we look at achieving net zero. We've used a tool called the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, CREM. Highly recommend people take a look at it if you haven't or are not familiar with it. It was started by a group of academics, not surprisingly, out of the Nordics. And so they've identified pathways to net zero along a 1.5 degree pathway by 2050. Ours is a little more ambitious for 2040. And what you can do is actually model your building. You input the information, the energy consumption, the building characteristics, the geography, which makes a whole lot of difference in terms of achieving net zero. And it can tell you, are you going to achieve net zero based on how the grid is getting greener, based on different factors about your building. It lets you run scenarios around if I exchange my chiller and cooling tower system for an electric heat pump system, how will that impact whether I'm stranded or achieving net zero? And I think it's a good tool because can you get to net zero today? I think in many cases, and Phil will probably touch on this as well, as we think about electrifying buildings, the whole point of that is that we can leverage a greener grid in the future. So I think can you design a building to try to ensure net zero in the future based on different assumptions about the grid and technologies such as on-site renewables and efficiency and things like that? I do think you can. I think it's incremental. And I think you have to take a longer term approach than trying to throw the whole package at a building today. I think you kind of have to look in many cases for a lot of our investment strategies, we have longer term budgets, whether that's 3, 5, or 10-year budgets. And you kind of have to take that approach of how do you integrate a lot of these different systems and practices and mechanisms into your budgets so that you can invest over time to achieve net zero and take advantage of what happens with the grid and renewables and battery technology and things like that.
Phil, what do you have to add there?
So certainly with new development, you have a blank sheet of paper to work from. You know, a lot of our buildings are not new, and so we really want to continue to leverage and lean into value creation from the existing building stock. You may hear this many times, but the most sustainable building is the one that's already been built versus that green or brown piece of land too. So the last thing anyone wants to do is throw away something that has useful life left to it. There's a law of diminishing returns into how much life you squeak out of that old car versus going out and buying yourself a shiny new Tesla. And it's the same with buildings and with electrification of buildings too. It doesn't make any sense to buy a building that has gas stoves and put all of those gas stoves out into the landfill while they still have 5 years or 10 years left of useful life. So we always have an eye to the fiduciary responsibility to spend our money wisely, but making those choices along the way to see where you can make those incremental changes to change that equipment that is near the end of its useful life or does make a good strong ROI on there too. So it's making those plans up front for new build, but how to really come up with a sensible renovation plan at the right time in the right cycle for the real estate that we have under our control.
Thanks.
Could I just add on to that real quickly, Loretto, which is, and I think, Phil, that brings up a really good point, which is, we have different investment strategies, as I'm sure GID does too, right? And some of these are open-ended in perpetuity vehicles, and some of these are closed-ended. Some of these joint ventures have very progressive investors that are tempted to spend quite a bit of money on achieving net zero ahead of the competition. And some of them are more business as usual. And so I do think that there's opportunities to create showcases. There's opportunities to test the boundaries of where we can go. We're doing that at 555 Greenwich and 345 Hudson in New York. It was interesting to see a lease this morning that we reviewed from a very large tech tenant where they are pushing us. And I think what you're seeing is really, from certain large pension funds, think Canada, think Europe, think certain US pension funds, from certain large tenants, it's the Googles and IBMs, the Microsofts, the accounting firms, the JP Morgans of the world. They are actually looking to groups like Hines to be kind of the nucleus that allows them to achieve their decarbonization in their real estate. And so I think there's opportunities to push the boundaries today because there's certain investors willing to put the money up for that, the equity, right? And then it will inform the longer term strategies we have as we're able to execute on this.
Thanks. One thing, Phil, you mentioned, talking about existing structures. Can both of you talk a little bit about ESG during the due diligence of the acquisition process and kind of just sort of some of the broader things that any investor or any acquisition manager probably should be thinking about as they're doing their due diligence? What are the key questions there? I'll start with you, Phil.
Sure. So we have a broad approach, but we tailor it depending on whether it's a development project or a stabilized deal that we're purchasing. For a stabilized deal, really it starts with in addition to and at the same time, because due diligence timeframes are still very tight. We have the same team conduct an ESG checklist, an ESG inventory. So that really tells us beyond just, yes, it's gas versus electric versus whatever the source of energy is, but how old is the equipment? What's its efficiency running at? What are the pool pumps? How are the elevators running? Are there EV stations already on site? Is there solar on site or is there potential for solar? And then really getting down into the detail of what are the plumbing fixtures and what's the flow rate? It gets pretty granular very quickly, but that's coming back to my opening statement around it isn't just one solution. And is there opportunities to make some quick hits? We want to make a good return on our investment. So right away, that low-hanging fruit of changing out to LEDs from compact fluorescence, leak detection systems. So really, we take an inventory, but then we create an action plan from that inventory, and within the first 6 months, and we build that into the asset underwriting within the first 6 months. We start to implement some of those improvement plans because they have payback to them too, so that makes good financial sense. And then we also conduct a climate risk analysis report on every property. So understanding what are the major physical threats and potential issues. Is there heat stress issues, wind, water stress, earthquake? So conducting that with a view then to understanding what does that mean. We've moved away from just generic desktop numbering to actually having our engineers, as part of their due diligence, conduct that on the ground and be able to, really inform, are there any things that we need to do right up front, whether it's stabilized or development deal too, but particularly, if there are some flood risks, then building into your longer term plan, what you can do about that with location of critical equipment and, increasing berm heights, enhancing stormwater drainage systems as well too. So taking the theoretical and making it practical very quickly in a way that real estate folks can understand.
Yeah, Adam, the due diligence process, what are some general tips that you might have for investors looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's pretty standard these days is a property condition assessment, a PCA, and we've been doing that for years in the industry. And I think we're starting to take it to version 2.0, candidly, which is how do you decarbonize the real estate? How do you make it more resilient? We've learned from the extreme weather events, you probably don't want your elevators and equipment in the basement. You're looking at the very simple things, but you're taking a 10 or 20 or 30-year approach on the weather events that Phil's talking about. You can do the climate risk assessments. Some of it's somewhat obvious. I mean, if you're going to buy a building in San Francisco these days, you're probably going to look at the indoor air quality systems because there is now a smoke season in this part of the country, right? As you look to decarbonize the real estate, I think the questions we always ask is, where can you make it more efficient? And I think there is kind of the existing notion of efficiency, and then there's also this hyper efficiency, this kind of circular approach to energy systems where, as we talk about data centers, and yes, will the landlord basically create a system to vent the heat? Absolutely. Any landlord's willing to do that for a tenant, I think. At the same time, why are we releasing heat energy? Why are we not throwing that back into the building and reusing the energy in a way that just makes it cheaper, cleaner, more efficient? I do think as we think about electrification, that goes to the indoor air quality as well. If you're not combusting fossil fuels on site, all of a sudden, I think you will find you have also higher indoor air quality. You go to a heat pump system, you're all of a sudden losing your cooling towers. If you lose your cooling towers, can you save 30 or 40% of your potable water? I think there's a lot of circular systems that you need to be thinking about in terms of acquisitions and certainly in the development process. And then finally, I do think the on-site renewables, how do you maximize that? And obviously, I get it. If you have an 80-story urban high-rise building, it's really hard to think about on-site renewables. That doesn't mean you can't access green energy. So I think there's alternative approaches to that. But with any kind of office campus, with any kind of garden multifamily, certainly with warehouses, looking at the structural support for your roof, making sure you can actually put solar panels on there, I think is actually something important. It's something we've been doing in Europe now, saying, as a standard part of any due diligence, can the roof support photovoltaics? What's the cost to get us there if it can't? And then, when you look at photovoltaics, are you renting them or are you owning them? So I think there's all kinds of new financial structures we all need to be accustomed to as well in terms of how we're achieving the green energy and who's going to own those renewable energy credits at the end of the day. So I would say, one thing I always ask our teams is, have you asked your mechanical engineer, how do you make the building electric? It doesn't have to be tomorrow, it can be in 10 years, but have you looked at the systems and how do you make the building electric? Have you at least gone down that path to analyze the cost and the return? Yeah,
I think adding into that, in the same way that Heinz, our focus is on development for longer term strategy. So this really helps us make, strategic decisions around, we know where the site is, but where's the project going to sit within the site, reviewing topography, local waterways, tree coverage. So building resiliency into the design up front, I think, certainly creates a path for asset protection and value creation in the future. So, whether it's what's the site coverage, hardscape versus softscape, what's going to be the reliance on water irrigation and heat stress, having some softscape or xeriscape environments to lessen the impact of heat stress too. So all these incremental factors build to lower energy utilization, which is lower cost in the future and lower burden on the HVAC equipment as well. And
the last point I'll make, Loretta, kind of tying it back to whenever we're doing our due diligence, there's also the financial due diligence. I would say when you look at your lease roll, your tenant roster, who's got a net zero commitment, who's got a net zero carbon target, that, if Ernst & Young is in your building, if Google is in your building, there's probably an interesting partnership that can be achieved. There's probably some cost sharing that might even be able to be achieved. And then from a financial structuring perspective, think about the tax incentives. When our car died a few months ago, and so when we went and looked at buying cars, we looked at electric vehicles. We also looked at electric vehicles where you still have the $7,500 tax credit. These kinds of incentives exist in commercial real estate as well. There's in California, we have the net energy metering, and it's going from 2.0 to 3.0. And so what are the implications when you're thinking about renewable energy systems and things like that? So and unfortunately, it's kind of county by county, state by state in commercial real estate in the US. There is some federal regulation. But how does the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of support or incentivize some of this? And I think there is a financial aspect that bring the finance and accounting people along for the ride with you on this.
And I just want to mention to our audience, we are taking questions. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. If you're interested, if you have any questions for Phil or for Adam, go ahead and submit them, and we'll be asking them to them as well as we go through this panel. But I do want to take a jump into, you mentioned the sort of patchwork of ordinances. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that poses and also how you might be addressing some of those issues. I can start with you, Adam, and then we'll go to Phil.
I mean, for Hines, I think maybe it's not easier, but maybe we're more aware. We're vertically integrated. We have on-the-ground teams in hundreds of cities around the world and quite a few in the US. I think they're very tied in with the local real estate groups and the local regulators. We're a developer, we're an acquirer. It's a constant conversation with the cities and the municipalities in which we do business. I would say our local teams candidly support us staying on top of these regulations, maybe better than many of our peers. And I think then when it comes to the higher level things, the Inflation Reduction Act, when it comes to things like the new SEC disclosures that we're going to have to abide by, we certainly rely on our internal groups, both my group, Global ESG, compliance, legal, outside counsel. I just think the vertical integration and the local representation is really how we're able to understand what's happening.
And Phil, what is the impact of the sort of increasing scale and scope of local energy reporting ordinances and others in that space?
So it's a help and a hindrance. From the hindrance perspective, currently we're tracking and reporting 15, 20 different jurisdictions across a large section of our portfolio. So that they all have different deadlines, there's different measures and different target pathways. And what we're measuring and what we're reporting on is different too. Some are based on an energy use intensity. What's your kilowatt hour per square foot use for this building? What's your gross greenhouse gas emissions? And then the target step downs and the interim dates and the actual end target dates are all quite different too. The reporting methodologies, the way you pay for the reporting, how you do the reporting, access to different portals across cities and towns and states certainly can create challenges. So that's the hindrance. The help is that really crystallizes your focus. If there is a deadline out there and that deadline has a financial penalty, that really does make folks pay attention. It crystallizes the need to conduct audits, really understand our buildings and our footprint, and build up some ground up improvement plans too. So we really keep, just like Adam was saying, keep an eye on what's happening at City Hall and local areas. It starts from a discussion, a white paper from a local town or city, to voluntary benchmarking, to tell us what you have, to then mandatory benchmarking, maybe energy only, then energy, water, waste, GHG. So then you conduct some audits to mandatory audits, to then actually having specific targets too. So, if you're looking at buying a building that has a voluntary benchmarking today, pretty much within 2 or 3 years' time, there's going to be some mandatory targets around there too. So it helps, as Alan says, to have your ear to the ground in all those local jurisdictions and bubble up what's happening. There are some resources for real estate folks, certainly in the US and across Europe, to get a better handle on what's coming in the pipeline. But then really make sure that you measure what's being asked. And the other great help is then it does give you access to data you might not otherwise have. We are owners of the real estate. We're not owners of all the meters and all the use of the power there too. So if there's a benchmarking ordinance in place, it certainly opens the door for us to be able to access all of that data, which then you can start making informed decisions on.
Adam, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I mean, look, real estate's always been a local business. I just think this is taking it that next step, which is, decarbonization and energy efficiency and ESG is still a local business. We're just applying it to real estate now.
Let's dig into some of the real estate strategies related to energy, to water, to waste management. Maybe we can take each of those in turn. I know, Phil, you've talked a little bit about electric vehicle charging stations and the infrastructure for that. Maybe let's start with that. Let's talk about some of these things in sort of granular detail. Phil?
So specifically on electric vehicle charging stations, yeah. So say we have 50,000 apartment units across the country. That's a lot of folks. EV cars are now, I think it's up to over 5.5%, almost 6% of new car sales in Q2 this year, up from just over 2.5% just a year ago. So this growth is coming from growing consumer environmental awareness, higher gas prices, car price parity, energy density of the batteries is improving, and obviously overall efficiency of the cars themselves too. Balanced with range anxiety and access to charging infrastructure is critical for the path to continue. I read somewhere just this morning that over 500,000 EV stations were installed globally last year, and that's more than was the total inventory of charging stations just 4 short years ago too. So the charging network is not there, and we're doing all we can to help us get there. Typically, drivers want to charge where their car is going to be parked for an extended period. That's either going to be at work or at home. We are at home for them, so access to a reliable charging network at our multifamily communities has really moved beyond a nice-to-have amenity to a must-have. Just like we have renters walking around with their cell phones checking cell service and Wi-Fi signal, it's really becoming a checklist on their list prior to leasing with us. So, we've currently got over 450 stations across our portfolio. It's growing. And key considerations are clearly you have to have access to power, and managing that demand on the system is important too. And we decided to go not just from straight NEMA plugs and simple plug and play to more advanced power sharing software enabled platform solutions that helps us with monitoring uptime and customer service, with charging cost plans as well, and be able to manage the whole portfolio from a single portal. So having charging stations that don't work is almost worse than having a charging station at all too. So we really ensure that the customer service delivery end of the charging station infrastructure is very important for us.
Just real quickly, Loretta, I just want to add on to the EV stations, because I think we always tend to think about it from maybe an office or multifamily perspective, but I think warehouse is going to be the future of this, candidly. We have just delivered a last mile warehouse in Los Angeles, where not only was each parking space EV ready, it had charging stations for the actual delivery vans and the trucks that are coming in. And I think you'll see more in the warehouse space where there will be electric trucks, probably autonomous, not too long from now, that will need to be charged at the warehouses. And so EV EV ready warehouses is the next phase of this as well.
And the great tie in there is that the warehouses have the roof space to have the solar to power the charging stations too. So you can have a whole closed circuit. That's the sweet spot.
We've got some questions coming in from the audience. I'd love to bring a couple of them in. One question. So talking more on the industrial side, for industrial assets that are net leased to a single tenant, how do you look to implement an ESG strategy given the limited control that you as an owner might have over the building usage? And so what are some of the things to be thinking about in that case? Anyone want to volunteer on that one?
Yeah, I can volunteer. It's a journey. You're going to have to reach out to your tenant. I mean, you've basically delivered them 4 walls and a roof with no HVAC in most cases even, and they've probably done that themselves as well. Your only metering access might be like the fire safety systems and the parking lighting. And so it is working and collaborating with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tenants that might be in that building. It is over time. This is why, I have a hard time digesting companies that have, or investment managers that have, we're going to be net zero carbon in 2025, because just your lease rollover is going to dictate some of this. And you need to start putting green lease clauses, and you can't really do that until the renewals come up. And so I think collaborating closely with the tenants, memorializing or codifying some of that in the leasing, it's got to be a partnership. And candidly, no matter what we do to decarbonize our real estate, we have to do it with the tenants as well. We have to bring them along with us. In some cases, that may be educating and training them. In some cases, it may be celebrating successes together. But I do think it's a journey we have to take together. And I think for many tenants, there is an interest to understand what they can do in many, many cases.
Yeah, I really underscore that, Adam, that it's really the partnership approach that works, and finding the right person at your tenant organization to speak with. We certainly, we have green leases in place, and obviously trying to bring those to the table every time a lease is up for discussion. But it's developing that relationship. We have, we were trying to install some meter monitoring systems at a couple of our buildings on the West Coast, and a little resistance from a couple of tenants. Go have a look-see on those tenants' websites and see what they're saying for their ESG strategy, and find the person within that sustainability team. They may not be in this country, often they weren't, and so making some more connections at the kind of ESG level. We tend to all we want to work closely together because we're all working towards a common goal here, and then relaying what the challenges were and why we were trying to do it really opened the door for us to implement the strategy we were trying to get done at that particular project too. So finding those relationships, finding out what is really driving your tenant. I was at the ULI conference a couple of weeks ago down in Dallas, and for the first time we had the ULI Greenprint folks that Adam helped to start attend the End User Product Council for so folks from Google and Microsoft were there too. So we had tenants and land building owners in the same room talking about a lot of the same challenges, and some great moments of clarity and understanding that we really, this is somewhere that we can all benefit from working together hand in hand, because everybody wants to save the planet, and everybody wants to spend less money as well. So you can do both of those things while implementing some ESG strategies.
I have another question submitted from the audience. So this is from Deke Schultz at Lionstone. He asks, is reliance on a green grid and electrification the right long-term decarbonization strategy for an asset? What about technology advancements in distributed energy, which can be more efficient than transmission, such as hydrogen fuel cells? In general, how do you handle such systems level theoretical needle movers in developing a long-term strategic pathway?
I would say relying on the grid getting greener should not be your end-all be-all strategy. It should be a tool in the toolkit, and you should track it and monitor it. You should leverage it when possible. And And I also think in deregulated markets, you can kind of access that today, and typically the premium is pretty low. So when you look at places like Houston, I think you've got to look at on-site renewables. You've got to look at power purchase agreements from an energy supply perspective. I think there's multiple options. I think battery storage will be a completely different landscape in 10 years. We've done a few rollouts in California and on the East Coast. I think there's a lot you can do, but I don't think you can rely on the grid getting greener, but I do think you should incorporate it into your calculations as you think about decarbonization. And when you track your progress to net zero, that will, of course, be a helpful tool, but it should not be what you rely on to get there.
Phil?
I do agree with Adam. Definitely have the awareness, and where you have the opportunity to speak with utility providers and working with industry groups. You know, we speak louder when we speak with a combined set of voices as well too. So note that there's an interest and a demand out there to continue to work on efforts to green the grid, but it's really about making your current demand on the grid today lower, either through use of on-site or off-site renewables, but more importantly, just by resident and tenant engagement and helping people behave differently and respond differently and interact differently with the building that they're used to interacting with, and providing the tools to do that. And we can talk about that, and we might be talking about in a little bit around the use of technology to really lower your impact on your electricity demands.
I think that's actually a great place to go next. So maybe we can sort of dig a little deeper into those strategies. Phil, do you want to continue on that, and then I'll go over to Adam?
Yeah. So again, coming around to the old adage of measure what matters. You got to know what your use is and where it's coming from. We on the energy side, we'll talk about energy first. There's a number of systems out there. We're working with an organization at the moment that helps us better understand where the demand load is being generated from, and what times of day, and being able to implement this in buildings that don't have a comprehensive building management system. That's one place. If you already have a building that has the BMS, then go fine tune that, make sure it's operating effectively, make sure the dials haven't been overridden, and certainly look at a retro commissioning of all of your equipment. It might have been installed 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago and never been adjusted or been completely overridden. So that's a great first place to start. And then, leveraging technology solutions to, even just tags on meters and load demand, and figuring out, does the gym need to get really down to 65 degrees by 5 a.m. in the morning, or when can you start that, and when you can operate that too? So it's a combination of hardware, having a piece of kit to go sit on the meter and on the areas that are drawing the power. It's the software being able to read that information, but most importantly, it's the liveware. It's the person in the field that has the app on their phone that gets the alerts to say, hey, we're approaching a demand measurement series, and we're just about to reach our peak, and so let's dial down the use of the compactor. Let's relook at our building use and footprint, and when dials are on and when dials are off. And then rewarding folks for doing that too. So it's really a combination of the equipment, the software that goes with it, and the person managing it, and making sure that those actions are taken to be able to lower your energy impact.
Adam?
Yeah, I take that even one step further. I think the technology is here today to achieve net zero carbon. There's a cost to it, but I think it's about human behavior. It's kind of getting out of the business as usual, the way we've done it for the last maybe 40 or 50 years. When you look at how Hines was founded by Gerald Hines, and there's an interesting article from the ASHRAE Houston group from 1961, where he talks about, things brand new, like curtain wall and modular floor plans. And this is the next iteration of that. This is, the engineers and architects, we value engineer a lot out of what they do and what they're offering, because I think they, in many cases, the top quality ones, whether that's local or global ones that we also use, it is about changing the decision-making process, and in some cases the incentives as well. From an energy efficiency and a operating net zero perspective, if it costs you a little more, is the investor willing to tolerate, getting to your promote 5 basis points sooner? But you're going to execute on a true net zero carbon strategy. There's incentives that can be put in place, and it can even be simpler. When someone says, but that's not part of my job description, well, okay, I guess all new job descriptions should say something about net zero carbon. If you're a building engineer or you're a property manager, now it is part of your job description. So I think there's a lot around human behavior that we have to get at through very simple things. And then I think too, even from an embodied carbon perspective, which I know we haven't touched on a lot, but the carbon and the materials we're purchasing, it's about taking the time to see what can be reused, what can be reclaimed. We have a building in Seattle, the Norton building, where they're achieving a 60% reduction in embodied carbon, I think even a little bit more, for no cost. It's simply changing the design process and really honing in on how do we actually achieve this, and working with our engineers and architects. And so I think in many cases, it's about human behavior, it's about incentives, it's about going out and finding groups that want to work with you on this and aren't just thinking about the next building is just like the last building we built. It's got to be a little bit different now.
What about, so we've talked quite a bit about energy, which is obviously one of the key elements of the environmental question, but what about water and waste? Are there any sort of strategies there that investors should be caring about or paying attention to? Anything that could help, make a building more sustainable and also create value?
I'll starting with water. Certainly, on the inside of the building, looking at the equipment you're purchasing or building into the development plan, and some of the basic levels of low flow toilets and sinks. And again, things get pretty granular pretty quickly, and people start talking about flow rates and things like that too. But having leak detection systems in place too, and some smart leak detection systems can really save you. Certainly water can save you a lot of loss damage on insurance claims as well. There's a lot of damage can get caused from water flow and tanks going. Moving to tankless systems can be more effective. Looking at the outside of the building, we've implemented some smart irrigation systems, really, from basic to very complex, tied in with weather patterns and measuring not just water flow, but evapotranspiration rates and really looking at soil types. You get into some pretty interesting botanic discussions with people about what plants are going to hold the root system together better with certain soil types. And then, the best irrigation system you have is the one you don't need. So then looking at xeriscape areas, everybody likes a little piece of grass, of course, but having areas that don't require irrigation because you've got, interesting natural grasses, and you've got some rockscaping, effective mulching of areas and turning areas into different uses as well too. So kind of having a whole mix of solutions for water consumption.
Yeah, I'll add on to the water before we get to waste. I think credit to the USGBC and the LEED framework. We've all been thinking about low flow, no flow toilets and low flow fixtures. I think Heinz and many of our competitors, GID I'm sure included, we maximize the low flow use without sacrificing occupant comfort, basically. You don't want a trickle to wash your hands. You need it a little higher than that. I think spot on, native landscaping, xeriscaping, minimize water, collecting rainwater things like that. These have all been going on for well over a decade now. At 101 California, we even have a worm farm to create our own, organic compost, basically. So I think there's a lot you can do that honestly is just standard now. It wouldn't cost you any more to have a low flow fixture on your sink than it would to just have a sink. And candidly, in many places throughout the country, it's probably just a requirement at this point, which is how accepted it's been. The other part, just going back to as we electrify buildings, you probably don't need cooling towers if you do it properly. And so that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of gallons of water a year that you could actually not be using. When we did it at the building in New York, we got rid of 800,000 gallons of potable water use annually. So about 30+%, over a third of the water use of that building. So I think in terms of water, there's a lot of things you can do that are very standard now. And then look at the HVAC system and how electrification could minimize water use as well. I think waste has also been around for quite a bit. I mean, look, I'm in the Bay Area bubble where we for sure, we have our 3 or sometimes 4 different bins. One strategy, I think it's interesting. So on Earth Day, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, we actually had a contest. Can you put everything in the right bin? And me being in sustainability, I probably should have gotten that right. And no, I did not. And I think, for me, again, it goes back to, I think a lot of the things around waste goes back to human behavior, candidly. Have the signage up that tells you, yeah, you can put a plastic container in the recycle bin, but not if there's food waste in there. So you have to wash it out, right? And if it gets too contaminated, they dump all the recycling out into the landfill anyway. So I also think the other part is a strategy we have found useful is centralizing the waste bins. So getting rid of trash cans, recycle bins, and compost bins at your desk and putting them not too far, just far enough that you have to take a short walk and think about where you're putting each container. And it actually significantly decreases contamination and significantly increases waste diversion from landfill, where you can achieve 80-90% diversion from landfill, actually.
Yeah, and jumping on that, certainly in the apartment space, we're dealing with high turnover of folks. The standard rate is 50%. So people are only with us for 2 years on average. And when people move out of buildings, they tend to generate a lot of bulk waste too. So we're looking at a couple of programs to help reduce that. Some great partners we're starting to have conversations with, that they'll come and assess a person's apartment and basically they're saying, listen, I'm getting on a plane tomorrow and I'm leaving all of this, and they'll put them into 3 piles and say, okay, these are the things that will help you sell, and they'll use their own networks or some other networks I won't say right now, but we'll sell this for you. We will donate this pile, and then this pile truly is trash, but we'll dispose of it responsibly. There's a cost to dispose of the trash. And there's some facilitation, but you're going to generate a whole bunch of money from this pile here too. So kind of thinking a bit more creatively about how to deal with the waste that gets generated. You still want to reduce what's going there in the first place and recycle, and certainly reuse as well. And then using technology, we're working with one of our partners on compactor monitoring systems. So that's basically saying it's on the pickup, every 3 days. But if it's only 3/4 full, then it doesn't need picking up. So having an alert out to the pickup trucks that, hey, miss this one, keep going. We'll save on pickups. We'll save on diesel from the truck coming around to pick it up, and we'll make sure that it's full before it gets picked up too. So lots of different ways to reduce waste across the portfolio.
And Loretta, one thing I'll add is I think, are you gonna see a lower cap rate or a higher return because you're minimizing water and waste? Candidly, probably not. It's so standard now. But what I will say is, if you find an operator who's paying attention to the details that Phil and I are talking about, they're probably doing everything else that will get you the higher return and the lower cap rate, right? You have to pay attention to these details, whether you're talking about the due diligence or you're talking about how you operate the property or how you develop it. Those little details actually indicate the quality of the real estate and the service you're going to get from the operations as well.
And I just want to remind the audience before we close out, if you have any final questions for Phil and Adam, we've got about 10 more minutes with them. Let's talk a little bit about the design front. How does the sustainable design, when you're thinking about new build, what are some of the things that you're thinking about? How do you set the stage for value creation in particular? And maybe how do you address the embodied carbon question as well? And let's go ahead and start with Adam on this.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpackage there. So there's obviously a lot of design considerations from a sustainability perspective, and then all of a sudden, within ESG, it becomes a conversation around not just the efficiency of the building, but the placemaking of the building and the community impact and the social value being created. And I will say, we're starting to more consistently run carbon life cycle analyses across our new developments to really understand from start and construction to deconstruction in 50 or 60 years, what is the full carbon footprint like? And that includes the embodied carbon of the materials. I mentioned the Norton Building example in Seattle, which our U.S. Property Partners Fund acquired and is doing a major renovation. And for no cost is achieving significant reductions in embodied carbon compared to what's market for Seattle. As a global developer, we found embodied carbon to be something we could hit pretty hard and pretty quickly on our supply chain. And so we partnered with Magnuson Klemenczyk Associates, a structural and civil engineering firm, and we've created, I think we're on version 2 of our embodied carbon guide, and we've actually released it. It's on Hines.com. It's an 80-page document on how do we, as Hines, as a developer, work with our supply chain to reduce embodied carbon? How do we analyze it? How do we manage it? How do we reduce it? So I would recommend, if anyone's interested, that resource is out there for free, and it's a partnership between Hines and MKA, and we keep it evergreen. So every 18 or 24 months, there will be new updates. It started with just the structural components, and now it includes some of the TI type stuff and the elevators. There's design components that are, I would say, are also, you have to think about the occupant health and well-being. There's design components now that we learned from the pandemic that maybe don't improve efficiency. If someone does not flush a toilet for 2 weeks, could you have Legionella? Yeah. So now all of a sudden our standard design calls for automatic toilet flushing on occasion. Same for the sinks. And so, there's a whole world around the design and placemaking. I think the part that is actually harder to quantify, but everyone wants to talk about, is the social value and the social impact. And there's all kinds of things. Is that creation of jobs? Is that community engagement? Is that affordable housing or affordable commercial space? And I think there's a huge focus Hines is putting on the social part as well, which I think we're talking about in another panel. But yeah, going back, it's about decarbonization. It's about high indoor air quality. It's about circular systems, resilience. All these get factored in. And for us, it's supporting each of our regional teams. We have our pre-construction group called Conceptual Construction that, touches all of our developments until we break ground. And so I think having that central group partnered with Global ESG actually lets our regional teams kind of figure out, okay, in Houston, this may not be market standard yet, but if you're doing it in San Francisco and Chicago and New York, we can bring this to Houston, and we can upskill our supply chain and have them work with us on achieving, whatever kind of target we want on the development.
And Phil, sustainable design?
Yeah, I'm really glad Adam talked about the social aspect here. We talk about environment a lot, and the next session is going to lead into this. But really, for us, placemaking is very important as well. We're working on a project in High Street, Atlanta, where we already own some office building, which is great space, a couple 100,000 square feet of office space. One thought might be you just tear that down and start again, but we're using that to anchor our mixed use development with close to 600 apartment units and 150,000 square feet of retail, and it's near the MARTA, so the train comes right here too. And so kind of bringing the whole live, work, play, got talked about years and years ago, 24-hour cities and all this too, but it's still, people want to People want to get out. People want to have that human interaction. There's a park on site that people can spend time with too, with pets and with families. And so people want to be able to interact with the environment which they live. And if they can work and shop and have downtime all within that same space, it drives the investment value up, and those investment decisions you build it with sustainable design, but really create a place where people want to spend time into.
Let's before we close out, I want to have each of you to sort of hit on your key takeaways. If you have a few of them, what are the key takeaways for anyone who's been watching this or who will watch it on the replay? What are your key takeaways on how a focus on the E in ESG, where is that going to drive value and returns for all stakeholders? Phil, you look ready to go.
I look ready to go. Sure. So I talked about it quite a bit, but understand your assets. Get under the skin of the assets too, both during due diligence. If you don't own it yet, then start to go beyond the physical property condition report and build a stronger, more resilient picture about that deal. And certainly go visit those properties you've owned for years. Conduct energy, water, waste audits. Look for inefficiencies and projects that will save you money. That will deliver a return, right? You spend green, save green by being green. Deliver a couple of good ROI projects up front to get the ball rolling. Look for that low-hanging fruit. LED conversion, water flow control devices, look at your motors. So deliver some good savings to get the ball rolling. For the development projects, lean in to make those good long-term decisions with project layout, landscape designs, building systems. But more than that, really, ESG isn't just a department within an organization. It needs to be throughout the DNA of the whole organization too. So at GID, we have a great ESG governance framework in place with committees, subcommittees, EC level, but it's really our property managers, our maintenance supervisors, the folks in the field that have some of the biggest impact, and then leveraging the relationships we have with our residents and with our tenants to be able to really buy into the strategies and understand that it's a win-win scenario for folks if you we're all working towards some great energy saving devices. Everybody wins too. So I'd say those are the key takeaways for me.
And Adam?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking with my old boss, who's the longest tenured person at Hines now, I think 47 or 48 years here. And everyone's busy. It just seems, even through a pandemic and what's now a recession, right? Everyone's really busy, whether it's an assistant property manager or an executive at the company. I'd say take a top-down approach to set the targets, set the tone, set the incentives, and then that should lead to a bottom-up approach that Phil's also talking about, which is now dig into each individual asset and see where you can make an impact. But I think that those have to meet. You will always have your on-site rock stars who are just going to make this asset sustainable, and they just love being in the community and doing that. I think it's even more important to have someone, and we've done this at Hines, Jeff or Laura Hines Pierce will call someone out for doing such great work in ESG at the asset level. And I think even small incentives like that actually go a long way toward making people feel like, yeah, it's a firm, but this is something that feels like a place I can call home for a long time. So I think it is about the human behavior, the top-down approach, and then encouraging the bottom-up initiatives that'll come out of that.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate, a lot of what you've said about sort of the incremental changes to hit these targets and the measurement. Technology is key, but also so is people and the partnerships that are involved and the relationships that are built, which, that's sort of what real estate is all about. Once again, I'd like to thank Adam at Hines and Phil at GID. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think this has been really helpful for our audience. Hopefully we get something out of it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Loretta. Thanks, Phil.
And now we're going to start with our second panel. We're going to take a look at the social side of ESG. And I'd like to welcome our next panelists, Dr. Suzette McKinney and Jim Ferris, to please go ahead and join us right here. Thank you, Suzette and Jim. In addition, I'd like to mention Kaylee McCall-Correa, Managing Director at Elian. She's not able to join us today, but maybe we can start with a couple of introductions. Go ahead and start with you, Suzette, if you can give us a quick introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Loretta. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suzette McKinney. I am a principal and the Director of Life Sciences at Sterling Bay, and we are a commercial real estate development firm, vertically integrated national firm headquartered in Chicago, Illinois.
And Jim.
Thank you, Loretta. I'm Jim Ferris. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Mosser Capital. And what we do is we are a fully vertically integrated owner, operator, and investor of urban workforce housing communities in gateway markets in California. Today, we own roughly 4,000 workforce housing units and approximately 100 properties across those locations.
You know, one of the things I think is going to be really interesting is to be talking about how the social risks and social factors can be implemented across different real estate asset classes. So, you know, maybe Jim, if we can maybe start a little bit about how the social impact can be seen in the residential side, and then I'll go to Suzette to talk a little bit about life sciences. So Jim, what are some of the aspects that are sort of special to residential?
Yeah, thank you, Loretta. You know, and it was interesting after listening to the prior panel, the emphasis even on energy and energy reduction from a local perspective, because we really think about impact in the residential space from a local community benefit and local community engagement. So we as a firm have been deeply integrated into all the communities that we've been invested in and operating in for, I think Hines and GID were about 60 years, we're similar. So being integrated into those local areas and being contributors to those areas has been a huge part of what we've done over that time. And that's really how we think about how are we having a positive social impact on the communities that we're investing in. There are many ways that we look at measuring that today. We've done it for a long time. We didn't take as much time to measure it. And it's great that now the details, as was mentioned as well, all these little details are now being articulated, learned, and then measured. And then that will hopefully facilitate folks understanding, hey, there is actually a benefit to the social impact or the social side of this that you can have with real estate. It's a natural assumption. Real estate, you look around the community and you can see what communities need positive social impact pretty easily. And so we do things like we measure how does the income of our new residents compare to average median incomes in the area? How are the rents that we offer in renovated units, how do those compare to Class 8 rents in an area? How much capital are we investing in acquiring new properties in communities that have low income and moderate income census tracts? And then how much capital are we committing and investing to improve and restore the quality of those properties and units? So I think that's enough of that for now. Thank you.
And Suzette?
Sure. So I think Jim hit the nail on the head when he spoke about working with communities and talking with community members to identify what some of the social challenges are within their specific communities. You know, there's a phrase that I've heard in my work and I really like, which says nothing for community without community. And essentially what is meant by that phrase is being inclusive, being communicative, and talking to people within communities and helping them or asking them to help you identify or help you better understand what some of the social challenges are, rather than just going into communities and assuming what those social challenges might be. But then I would also say, you know, once you identify or learn what those social challenges are, looking at your own internal processes and policies and procedures and figuring out what you can do as a company, a responsible company, to address those social issues and challenges. Those could be things such as what Jim mentioned, like income levels. Can you do something around hiring? Or perhaps it is affordability. Are you developing housing or other types of facilities within these communities that community members themselves may not be able to afford? So how do you address that issue? And then I would also add leveraging your philanthropic efforts to also fill the gaps with other social issues that may not be addressed by some of those areas that we identified. You'd be incredibly surprised at how far philanthropic and charitable efforts can go within these communities, because it also shows that there is a level of care and compassion for the community as well.
Can you, each of you, sort of talk a little bit about why the sponsor level leadership is required here? What is it about the real estate owner and what you bring as an asset manager to help kind of drive these social efforts forward? What can you do, and why is your leadership key? And I'll start with you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Loretta. I think, that was, as was mentioned in the prior panel as well, you really can set, as a leader in an organization, you can set incentives and focus. So you can help drive incentives and focus, and you can help set a mission and a mission within a strategy. So that can set the tone for the rest of the organization. That can create buy-in, and you can create protocols and processes within the organization to ensure that folks are aligned with that. If there's not alignment, you can create groups such as DEI committees or ESG committees. So you have the ability as a leader of a sponsor company to not only direct where are investment dollars going, but how are those investment dollars being treated, and then how are the teams and the employees within that are managing those buildings and those properties, how are they interacting with the community that you're in, right? So as a leader of a sponsor, you touch all aspects of that at the firm level, as well as connecting the investment community and providing them with the opportunity to make that social impact. And that's why it's so key to have the alignment between the leaders of the sponsor in particular, they have a focus of that mission and to be able to drive the implementation and execution of it.
Suzette, anything to add here?
Sure. I think within most companies, leadership starts at the top. And so employees and staff look to their leaders for direction on where they should go and how they should be gauging their own efforts and initiatives. But I also think, from a leadership perspective, there's also the opportunity. Jim mentioned DEI groups or other special interest groups. Leadership can also empower those groups to make certain initiatives on behalf of the company. But I think when you're talking about ESG, and particularly the social aspects of ESG, I like to think about it from a meta leadership perspective. And what I mean by that is, it takes all of us, and we all have an opportunity to lead up to our leaders, if you will, but also to lead down to those that may be reporting up to us, and then also to lead across. And what I mean by leading across is encouraging our colleagues and peers from other companies to join us in the efforts that we're working on to improve social conditions within communities and neighborhoods where we are all working.
I think, one thing, investors, when they look at something like this, they're always concerned about the bottom line. So how can some of these social impact or DEI programs, how do they create a competitive advantage? As an investor is looking at this, how does this really sort of drive the bottom line? And I'm sure you guys both have an answer on that. I'm going to start with you, Suzette, though.
Sure. It's interesting that you asked that, because I was just speaking with someone the other day about this very same question, although it was not so much ESG focused as it was DEI focused. But, again, these are efforts that really take all of us. And from a competitive advantage standpoint, I think, first of all, when companies are being considerate, whether it's DEI specifically, ESG, or both, what we have to understand is that participating in those types of initiatives, incorporating an ESG culture, does give us a competitive advantage because it challenges us, if you will, to look at our work from these multiple perspectives. And similar to DEI, when you have diverse people working with you, it gives you an opportunity to see challenges and to solve challenges from varying perspectives. And so I think that that's where the competitive edge comes in, is really challenging our company to, look at ESG from these multiple perspectives and encourage our team members to identify and develop creative solutions to what can be some very complex problems and challenges. And, in the commercial real estate industry, we're all pretty much friendly for the most part. I think it also provides great opportunity for us to challenge our colleagues, within other companies, and perhaps even, develop specific challenges, who did it best, or, who's doing the most. But at the end of the day, it's friendly competition for us, but it's greater benefit for communities.
Jim, can you speak a little on the competitive advantage?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. At the firm level, there are a ton of things that can be done to increase your advantage as a firm and as a strategy and as a manager by implementing DE&I and ESG objectives. We've certainly found that the available talent pool for us as a small firm has widened when we've communicated our mission towards supporting affordable housing and some of our affordable housing goals, and we found that folks resonate with kind of the local focus that we have with the communities that we're in and the history that we have of benefiting those communities. So that I think singularly has kind of attracts more talent for us as a firm. There are a myriad of other ways you can incorporate that, as mentioned by Suzette, within the firm. I think from an investment strategy standpoint, it's been clear over the past cycle that workforce and affordable housing strategies offer outsized returns similar to and sometimes better than traditional market rate or Class A strategies. And what we have found operating in this space over several decades is that there is more downside risk protection in rents and occupancy in our strategy in affordable and workforce. And as folks are tracking that more, and there are more institutional investors that are getting involved in affordable and workforce, they're actually realizing those benefits. But it's widely known there's a humongous shortage of affordable housing in the US. There's a huge shortage in California where we're focused on. So just applying basic market fundamentals, there's an insatiable demand where a supply doesn't exist yet to meet that demand. So you're going to have more resilient demand for units at the prices that you're offering, and that will reduce vacancy. And then, well-operated affordable housing projects and well-operated workforce housing projects are able to stand out versus their peers, and they within that space, and they create more engagement for the residents and more commitment from residents to stay. And so what that does is that reduces tenant turnover, which is a huge cost, as was mentioned, to the environment when you turn over units, you renovate units, and also to the bottom line of a project. And so by having that wide pool of demand and having a reduction in actual turnover, and you also have less exposure to market rate fluctuations depending on the strategy you're in. And so there are many defenses that you have from a return perspective. And what we've found, and what I've seen with peers, is there is no limit to investing in these strategies from a return perspective. You can get 30% IRRs, 50% IRRs, and you're not doing anything bad to the communities or residents, but you're able to participate in the market upside when cap rates compress and when rents go up as well.
Thank you, Jim. I just want to remind the audience that you can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will be posing those to Jim and Suzette as they come in and as they sort of fit into the conversation we're having. I want to go to you, Suzette. I want to ask you, I want to continue this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about DEI. What are some of the challenges that the life sciences industry faces when it comes to DEI?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Loretta. I think it's a very great question, and one that we tend to talk about a lot in the life sciences sector. I think one of the biggest challenges for the life sciences industry when it comes to DEI is this issue about access. It's been well documented that female entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color typically don't have as much access as others do in the life sciences space. Now, if you are an entrepreneur, that access could be to capital, to mentors and advisors, or just to networks. So that's one large challenge. I think another large challenge for DEI with regards to the life sciences is that oftentimes when we talk about the life sciences, we're really talking about the entrepreneur or the investor, and we never really think about other roles within the life sciences that aren't entrepreneurs or investors, but they support entrepreneurs and investors. So those could be anything from the coffee shop operators to the facility managers. And so another challenge for DEI within the life sciences comes into play with regards to hiring. We have to think about hiring diverse groups of people, especially if there are opportunities available for roles that don't require a highly technical degree. So those are some of the biggest challenges that I see. And, I'm excited that more recently, I'm beginning to see more and more efforts that are geared toward addressing those specific challenges. I will say here at Sterling Bay, we have an initiative that's called the PRISM Initiative, and it's our virtual technology, life sciences, healthcare, and technology incubator and accelerator. And the PRISM Initiative has specific programs that are geared toward providing greater levels of access to female entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color. But separate and aside from entrepreneurs, some of those other roles that I've spoken about, we have partnered with entities that assist us with hiring and casting a wider net so that we can hire more diverse personnel, even more diverse vendors and subcontractors that work on our projects. And, those are some of the areas where I would say, as you identify challenges with DEI, it's not enough to just identify them. It's not enough to just talk about them, but you have to translate those thoughts and those discussions into action. And I think once we begin to see more and more actions taking place, that's when we'll begin to see these issues and challenges around DEI begin to minimize.
Absolutely. Maybe, Jim, you can talk a little bit about translating that to action, some of the things that you're done, and some of the questions that investors are having about this action.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I love the connection to technology and the use of technology and how that can help support that. A lot of what we're talking about is gathering information, right? So a lot of it is gathering information, and part of that challenge is as questions are asked by investors, they're continuing to go, excuse me, a layer deeper. It's not just, oh, do you know what D&I is? Do you know what it stands for? Do you know, excuse me, do you have a D&I mission within your firm? Do you have a person at your firm who's dedicated to that? Then it's, what are the goals? Excuse me. It's hard to manage the COVID environment these days. So not only do you have a committee, so, okay, we developed a D&I committee a couple of years ago. Now investors are asking, okay, what are the goals and initiatives of that committee? And Also, who developed those? Were those developed by the CEO? Were they developed by the board of directors? Does the committee develop its own goals and initiatives? And the challenge is all of this, even gathering all the information, is a lot of work. It's a lot of energy and effort. So there has to be a focus towards it. You know, you can't just feint that you're interested in DE&I and then get sign off from an investor or consultant that you're committed to that. So they're going to ask all the tough questions. They're going to ask, how many women and minorities are in your investment committee? How many women and minorities are in senior leadership positions at your firm? What decision-making capabilities do those folks have, right? What is the, you know, they're asking, what are the percentage of women minorities throughout your firm? You know, and then outside of those types of questions, they're digging into, okay, what type of training programs are you implementing? How are you developing and making sure that your policies and procedures are inclusive of all folks within your firm, and how are you facilitating ways for folks to step up and improve their own skills and to be promoted within your firm? And what is your history of doing that? So even just gathering all this information, we had to wait 2 weeks for my HR department. Now I dig on them, but it's a lot of digging and a lot of information to gather. And you have to dedicate resources to do that. So we have an analyst on our team that now is dedicated to tracking incomes for new residents, right? And it's easy to track rents versus the market, but when we have 4,000 units, I think GID said they have 50,000. So tracking all of the incomes in each of those properties versus area median incomes is work, right? And so the use of technology will allow us to do that easier and to gather more data easier. Being able to incorporate that and gather, as we've discussed several times, with all of the little details that go into each of these aspects, and that are, the first part is even awareness of what the details are that you need to be looking for. Then, okay, then we need to pay attention to X, Y, and Z. How are we going to track that going forward? That's a challenge. And then how can technology improve our ability? So their technology is like measurable, for example, that can track kind of your ESG performance, and we've modified that in a way that we can also track social impact. And so, no, those are some of the thoughts that we have on that.
And Loretta, can I make another comment?
I was just gonna go to Suzette. Do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, well, I just want to highlight what Jim is saying. You know, he's talking about the use of technology to gather data and information, and use that data and information for the purpose of measuring your progress and your performance. And, you know, I come from a public health background, and we often say, if it didn't get measured, it didn't get done. So, you know, to Jim's point about measurement, that is critical. But I think another point that Jim mentioned that I really want to highlight a little more is this idea of training. You know, I would say, obviously, DEI is still a relatively new term. It's still a relatively new practice. You know, if we're really talking about translating discussions into action, DEI is a new practice that many companies don't have a lot of experience with. And some of the aspects of DEI are not intuitive for everyone. So the idea of developing training, I also think, is very important. But what goes along with that is developing some sort of schedule of regularity for that training. You know, taking not just your team members and your employees through that training, but ensuring that the executive staff, the leadership, is also doing the training, as well as the board members. Because if we go back to what we were speaking about earlier in the discussion, a lot of this comes from the leadership, and the tone and the message that the leadership exhibits is going to be what the rest of the team will follow. So I neglected to bring up training, but since Jim brought it up, I just really wanted to highlight it and the importance of that training and doing so regularly.
And kind of building on some of what Jim was saying, Beyond just DEI, which to say just DEI seems to limit it, but what requests are you receiving from investors to address social element up and down, in addition to DEI, definitely, but what are some of the other requests investors are providing to you? Suzette and then Jim.
Yeah, I think some of the requests are coming from investors, but they're coming from others as well. First and foremost, Jim mentioned this as well. How many women and people of color are in your leadership, in your company? How many exist on your boards or on your investment committees? So those are some of the questions that I see quite regularly. But then other questions that I see are questions around what are we doing within communities where we are building and developing? How actively have we engaged with those communities, especially communities that have a lot of historical significance? How well do you understand the history that's there? And how will you honor and pay tribute to that history? Or at a minimum, not come in and degrade the history. You know what I mean? So those are some of the most frequently asked questions. Others include, how are you providing more equitable access to participation on your projects? In other words, are there women-owned firms that you're using for subcontractors? Are there minority-owned firms that you're using as subcontractors? And what level of participation are you allowing to those women and minority-led companies for participation in your projects? And so back again to the point about measurement, we have begun specifically measuring not only how much money we are spending with women-owned firms and minority-owned firms, but we are also including those firms in some of the bigger events that we're doing. And events is not the right word, but really, if you think about, for example, like a groundbreaking, oftentimes, it's the leadership, it's the, government officials, but how many times do you see a woman who owns her own, general contracting firm have the ability to stick the shovel in the ground for a project that she worked on and speak to an audience about how starting her company and having an opportunity to work on a large scale project not only changed the trajectory of her life, but the trajectory of the lives of all of her employees. So we've begun doing a lot of things in that vein as well, just really to bring greater visibility to these companies, because we think that might also help them be able to do additional work. So it's essentially creating compounding opportunity, I would call it. Not only giving a woman-owned firm or minority-owned firm an opportunity on your project, but what level of visibility are you giving them so that other companies learn about their work and the quality of their work, so that they have additional opportunities that come behind the one that your company provided.
Thank you. Jim, anything to build out here?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about a lot is education and how are we educating ourselves on how we're making an impact, how are we educating ourselves and how we can measure those impacts. And it's kind of a circular thing with investors. Investors are getting educated on what entrepreneurs and operators and business folks are doing at the ground level. And then they're learning more. And so they're asking some of those deeper questions, right? And so I think a lot of it is, what we did in regards to DE&I a few years back is we just looked at what have we been doing? What have we done as an organization? What have we done with the communities that we've been invested in? How have we behaved? And what does that mean from a DEI perspective? And what we realized is that, hey, we've been doing a lot of what people are talking about now more. Again, I think they talked about this a lot back in the 60s in the civil rights movement, but now they're talking about it a lot again. And we've been doing this stuff since the 60s, right? Since the grandfather started this. And how do we measure that and how do we articulate that so that folks can understand, what we do? And there are other companies, like Other companies have very advanced training and development programs, and that's a core tenet of D&I. How are you training and developing employees and providing them with opportunities? We have a program internally called Mosser University that is a phrase that we have used for a long time, and it talks about how are we training within the building trades, how are we training and developing folks and developing their skills to be multitask oriented. We've developed folks from janitors into, construction foremen, and that really increases not only does that benefit the firm because we have loyalty and continuity, but it really, really improves the opportunity of those individuals. When someone comes in where they have no skills and they're hired as a janitor or as a security guard, and you can look back and you can see how those people have developed and what skills they have and how much more marketable they are and how much more money they can make. It really feels good to be able to do that. And so we started looking at that stuff, and we started organizing and tracking what are the things that we've done. And it's kind of like we have a question about how does it relate to the onset or the acceptance of environmental impact and how is social impact in a scale. And a lot of it is education is such a big component, and then it's how can you track the data? How can you verify for an investor if they have a social impact lens and they made an investment from that lens, what were their returns? And so that all takes time. Hopefully with the onset of technology, we'll be able to see more clearly, we'll be able to gather that information, we'll be able to set benchmarks easier. I was really happy to see D&I survey put out by Ferguson and a lot of the trade associations that we all know. And I was shocked at the questions that they asked. And it's really going to be a benefit to have that survey continue and to have more surveys like that. And that's going to inform DDQs for consultants and investors. And that kind of pushes forward that cycle of development of this idea of social impact investing. And it doesn't have to be a sacrifice to do so.
I assume you mean shocked in a good way, not shocked in an appalled way.
No, shocked in a good way. Like I was like, wow, they're really asking these questions, and she's like, they want all the details, which is good because you need them in order to understand it. Yeah.
Suzette, anything else here to add?
No, I think that this has been a great discussion so far.
I think, talking a little bit about what we were talking about in the panel before, we got really deep into sort of a granular look at, sort of the physical assets and some of those questions as well. And this is the real estate industry. What are some of the things that that you can do at the physical asset level to support a social impact strategy? What are some of the things that you're thinking about when you're talking about the building itself? And how that can sort of play out. Are these things that investors are asking you about? And are there ways that you sort of dig in here? I'll maybe start with you, Suzette.
I would say, with regards to the building itself, I spoke about hiring in the beginning, and looking at how diverse groups can be hired into some of these roles, how non-traditional team members can be hired into some of these roles. From a building perspective, particularly in the life sciences, we also are very concerned about just quality of life for the people who will work within the buildings. So that's everything from, what type of amenities exist in the building to even, believe it or not, the health and safety standards of the building itself. And now, post-COVID in the life sciences sector, with pretty much 100% of the office market going to remote work during the height of COVID, and even today, still seeing quite a bit of hybrid work where you only have people in the office for shorter amounts of time each week. In the life sciences sector, we often say, scientists can't do their experiments from their kitchens at home. So you think about it from that perspective, people have to come into the building. But there are many people who are still very much concerned about being in a facility with COVID still circulating, despite, all the things that we've done to try and get rid of it. So, we are now developing a new life sciences building that has open air terraces on every single level, which is not something you typically see in a laboratory building, but we're doing it to try to address some of the health and safety concerns that people will have and reservations that they will have with regards to coming into the building. So I would just say, the short answer is really just thinking about the person's full quality of life and thinking about how much time they will need to spend in the building and what types of amenities and other comforts can be built into the physical plant itself that addresses those needs.
Jim, anything to add here?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate, Suzette, that you mentioned health and safety being an important aspect of how the life science industry can affect social impact. I think equally in residential space, that's one of the things that we're definitely thinking about is how do we improve the health and safety of all of our residents, right? And how are we improving the safety of the buildings from an access standpoint? One of the things that we do is we replace and install new entry systems at almost every building we require. And so what it does is that provides security around who's actually living in the units, because they have to go exchange out their keys for a fob. And it also helps increase the level of security outside of the building and within the immediate neighborhood. And we do the little things that was talked about in the energy panel. We're putting out lights or more lights outside so that it's safer at night. We're making sure that all the common areas are well lit. We're having security cameras at various locations to make sure that all the residents are safe and secure and feel that way. And one of the things that we take a lot of pride in is the institutional level of management that we provide for a lot of our residents that typically do not get a high level of management or a high level of responsiveness. And so, we take a lot of pride in our levels of responsiveness and care that we take of all the buildings that we operate in. Whenever we buy a new building, a lot of times we're buying buildings that have been under damaged, whether it's physically, financially, and we'll go in and we'll address a lot of the deferred maintenance that is piled up oftentimes in some of these projects. And so we don't financially benefit from all of those improvements, but all of the residents that are there, whether they're affordable tenants or middle-income tenants or new middle-income tenants, everybody benefits from us improving the property, us bringing it up to a standard that we see fit, and where people can feel proud of where they are living. That's one of the special aspects of the residential sector is it has such a big, home has such a big impact, right? Where you live, how you feel about where you live, the neighborhood that you're in. And so we look at it as a unit by unit, building by building, block by block, and community perspective. And our goal is to improve all of those along the spectrum as much as possible in our strategy and in each of the investments that we make.
Thanks, Jim. Suzette, you mentioned COVID-19. The pandemic has been it has revealed some really, really alarming healthcare disparities across this country. What are some of the reasons for these disparities, and how can life sciences address them?
Well, what's very interesting is that all of the healthcare and life expectancy disparities that we heard about during COVID, they all existed prior to COVID, but no one paid very much attention to them. I think COVID just highlighted them. But what we know is that many of those disparities are due to things that are called the social determinants of health. So, again, we're talking about ESG. When I say social determinants of health, these are things that most of us take for granted every day. Access to proper education, access to employment, having transportation to be able to go all of the places where we need to go, having the ability to live in safe and secure housing, which Jim just mentioned a few moments ago. So healthy and safe neighborhoods. Those are just a few of the various things that fall under the category of social determinants of health. But essentially, they are all of those things that make life of high quality in all of the places where we go to school, where we live, where we work, where we seek to receive services that we might need, healthcare services or any other types of services, but also where we might choose to seek religion. And so what happens is when people don't have access to the very basic social determinants of health, it pushes them further and further down that rung of access to a point where they literally have access to not much at all. And it begins to impact their health and their living situations and other things that long-term decrease their life expectancy and the quality of their health. So I often, when I'm thinking about this and thinking about how I'm going to do my work, I always think about it from a perspective of, what it boils down to is economics. Because if a mother and a father are worried about how they're going to put food on the table at night, then guess what? They don't have the capacity to think about when they need to go for that follow-up doctor's appointment because they are concerned about feeding their children every single day. So that's what it boils down to. In terms of how the life sciences can help alleviate some of these social determinants, again, it comes down to economics. So I think for those of us working in the life sciences industry, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do within the scope of our own work that provides greater access to education or greater access to employment for people living in areas that don't have as much access as many of us do? In our developments, how can we make our developments more accessible from a transportation perspective? It's great if the development is accessible by vehicle, but is it also accessible by public transportation? And what about some of the more non-traditional but becoming increasingly popular modes of transportation? Biking, scooters, skateboards, or just simply walking. And so I think in the course of our work, we have to just first and foremost educate ourselves about what are the social determinants of health and what can we be doing in our developments, but also for those of us that are building life sciences developments, but also for those of us who are entrepreneurs and the owners of life sciences companies, what can we do to create more opportunity and more access to people who may be experiencing some of these extreme disparities, whether it's in health or life expectancy or other social factors.
And what are some industry examples of some of these social impact strategies? What are some examples of social impact strategies that are working? And maybe you can also mention some strategies that aren't working so well. And I might start with you, Jim, and then go to you, Suzette, as well. And if you just want to talk about what's working and ignore what isn't, that's okay too.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Loretta. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and I think it's important, as Suzette talked about physical health, it's also the mental health aspect of, how that was affected by COVID, how that's affected by folks who have that economic disparity and economic opportunity disparity. And so we operate in urban areas in California. It's well documented that there's a huge mental health crisis throughout the country, particularly in areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other urban locations. Part of that mental health can be addressed in partnering with local organizations that provide services. So like what we have done and what we can do is we can partner with local groups We can offer them spaces in our buildings. If we have mixed-use properties, we can use the relationships that we have within the community, help them find good locations that they can operate out of. We can provide volunteer services through our firm, and we can provide profit sharing and donations from either the principals or from the firm itself. One of the partnerships that we've done recently in that regard is it's a public-private partnership with a street surveillance group called Urban Alchemy in San Francisco. And they were focused on trying to clean up some of the streets in downtown San Francisco, specifically the Tenderloin neighborhood. And we've seen a lot of different programs over the years that haven't worked, and I could address some of those in a minute, but this group, Urban Alchemy, has been able to significantly, in a positive way, alter the composition of those streets down in the downtown Tenderloin area of San Francisco. And it's amazing to see because it got so much worse during the pandemic. And then there's some other legal changes that happened in the city, but then Urban Alchemy came in and they've kind of provided a sustainable benefit over the past year or so, which has been very promising to see. And this is a group that takes ex-convicts of some sort or another and gives them an opportunity to improve these neighborhoods, and they're able to somehow relate with and kind of diminish the level of nuisance activities that happens. And it's been a phenomenal experience for us. A lot of the programs that don't seem to help are programs that facilitate things like mental health and drug addiction and homelessness on the streets. So there's tons of programs out there that make it easier for you to use drugs on the street, make it easier for you to sleep on the street. And neither of those are good for your mental or physical health, as everybody knows. And so we found that there's a lot of programs out there, particularly around this idea of homelessness as a business, right? So there are groups that exist based on perpetuating the problem of homelessness. And so those are the ones that we struggle with. And oftentimes those are deeply integrated to some of the local community and city bureaucracies that control funds and how they're allocated. But there is the business around homelessness that needs to be fixed, right? Not all of the services that are provided in that industry are bad. Some do good, but a lot of them don't fix the problem. They only allow it to perpetuate. As far as other aspects of how we can make a social impact, I mentioned again, partnering with organizations. So when you think about what are the core social issues that we face, you're talking about education, healthcare, housing. These are three of the core issues. They're all directly related to real estate. And once again, location. And so what we do and what other sponsors can do is they can support local organizations on both the public or the nonprofit side that are filling the gaps that exist that we're talking about, like filling the gaps in education. So I'm involved with a SEO Scholars San Francisco, which is helping underserved youth who don't have access to quality education and getting them the opportunities to get into some of the top colleges in the country. And then after that, they help them with getting internships in some of the top institutions in the country. And it's really a program that can completely shift the socioeconomic status and opportunities that someone faces in some of the difficult environments that were mentioned, where there simply isn't the time to worry about if somebody did their homework or not, because they're more worried about are we gonna have shelter, are we gonna have food on the table tonight. Let me know if you're looking for more on that.
Yeah, I was like, do you have anything else here?
As far as positively, so we can do that. One of the things I really love in the neighborhoods that we invested in and we invest in is, improving the utilization of retail spaces in our buildings. If we have mixed use properties downtown or in other areas, taking a low use, like if it's furniture storage, or if it's a convenience or liquor store. Everybody knows there's a ton of those around inner city neighborhoods. You don't need any more convenient or liquor stores. So I love taking out a liquor store and putting in either a nonprofit organization who can provide a service to that property, or putting in cafes or restaurants or bars, things that improve the vitality and vibrancy of that community, and also at the same time increase the level of safety in that area. And you know, we love the use of technology where we can in regards to these aspects, like when it comes to improving access, right? So improving access to non-traditional renters through various bond sharing programs. There are now more access to even for-profit rent relief technology programs that offer rental lifelines, and also even do it without requiring repayment in order to keep folks in their homes and keep them through what can be a situational distress as opposed to a structural inability to pay rent. So we love applying technology to these problems when we can, and then as well as to security, like I mentioned before. You know, now you have the ability to have remote security guards, right? Where people can have live camera feeds, they can talk directly to someone who's loitering outside a property, and they don't have to be there. They could be doing this at 20 different locations at the same time. And so it lowers the cost of providing a higher level of security, which we love as well. So those are some of the things that we do.
Suzette, what are some of the social impact strategies that you see that are really working out there?
Yeah, a couple in particular that I'd like to highlight. So we have a project in Philadelphia that we're working on. Similar to Mosser, we also do the majority of our work in urban settings. And so our partner out in Philadelphia is a company called Botanic Properties. And they've become known for developing within the life sciences space, specifically CGMP or biomanufacturing spaces. And they've developed a training program that offers a certification for people to, you know, provide that biomanufacturing support, sort of like a biomanufacturing technician certification program that can be targeted to people who are unemployed or underemployed. And it gives them a direct job pipeline into the life sciences industry, into an aspect of the life sciences industry that can be transformative for themselves and their families. So this is a program that our partner Botanic developed, but it's one that we are also looking to replicate in other parts of the country where we're developing. You know, when you talk about economics and removing the burden of worrying about food or shelter, you know, it's being able to create jobs for people that I think can really be transformative. So that's one that I would specifically like to highlight. And the question itself reminded me of some work I did just a few years ago where I was working with a group of hospitals, and similar to what we were talking about earlier, this group of hospitals and other healthcare organizations got together with some local community-based organizations and really did a listening tour of a number of communities that were experiencing some of these social challenges, as well as healthcare and life expectancy disparities, to identify, you know, what the problems were specifically within those communities. And again, as expected, it came back to economics. And so one hospital in particular went back and they just started gathering data on the effectiveness of, you know, their own hiring processes. And one of the things that they identified was that all of their entry-level positions, people would come into those entry-level positions and stay in them, like never leave until they retired. And they dug a little deeper, and what they found was that most of those people just didn't have higher level skills that would enable them to be promoted up into other positions within the hospital or the healthcare system. So what the hospital did was partnered with the local university to come in and provide educational courses to their entry-level staff. And essentially what happened, the entry-level staff began to obtain new skills, higher level skills that enabled them to get promoted up within the healthcare system. And as those entry-level positions opened up, they targeted the hiring for those entry-level positions to communities that were experiencing higher levels of social challenges, healthcare disparities, and life expectancy disparities. I highlight that example because I think it is a great example of how an institution or even a company can track data about practices and who's in what positions and who's doing what, and essentially using that data as a tool to develop a solution that not only helps your existing staff, but can also have broader, farther reaching impact with regards to the social issues that we're talking about. It's a great example of just using creativity and data to do good for multiple levels of people. And Loretta, to your question, just one additional comment about, what's not working. First, I'd like to say, I think that there are great programs and great initiatives that are working across the country that many companies are engaged in. What's not working well is that there needs to be more. There are, I think we can all just take a look at our individual, companies and firms where we work and what we're doing. And there's always opportunity for all of us to do more. But I think what we all have to recognize is that the bottom line for all of us improves as we do this work. So the more that we're all doing it, the better it is for all of us.
One thing I've noticed is even though Suzette, Jim, you guys are working in very different real estate spaces, I actually think it's really interesting how much what you've said dovetails into each other, that there really is a lot of common ground in this. I know we're coming down toward the last few minutes of our panel. So I'm hoping that each of you can share a few key takeaways, things that we'd love the audience live, as well as anyone watching on the replay, things we want them to take away and think about. Maybe I'll start with you, Suzette. What are a few, maybe, just a couple key takeaways to bring off from here?
Yeah, I work for a commercial real estate development firm, and we are developing properties all across the country, multiple asset classes, and I just think it's very important for the commercial real estate industry to pay close attention to the cities that you're going into, the neighborhoods and the communities where you're doing your development, and being conscious of what's happening in those cities and in those communities, and go in as a great partner. Don't just come in as, a company wanting to do development, but a company that, yes, wants to do development, but also wants to see, benefit to the community, but benefit to the city as well. I think that's something that we can all agree will help our projects move forward quicker, faster, better, but also have great positive impact on the areas where we are engaging in these projects. And then, another example is just what I said a moment ago. The bottom line is better for all of us when we think about the social issues that we're seeing all across the country. I would say now more than ever before. A lot of us are concerned now about an impending, recession. And I think as a society, we're only as good as our weakest members. So just think about what can we be doing to improve the quality of life and improve the situation of our weakest members. There's an old saying, I think it says something like a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's a great perspective to have when we are thinking about ESG and DEI. Some of us, have more resources and are able to do more. But I think just from the examples that I gave, there's something that we can all do, even if it's just looking at your own internal practices and procedures and tracking your own internal data and figuring out what can be done to provide some social benefit.
Jim, final takeaways?
Sure. Yeah, I love that. I love how Suzette and I both had such a big emphasis on location. To your point, Loretta, on very different product types. I also really enjoyed that the environmental panel is so focused on location as well, right? Location and the details, the small details that when compiled can have a huge impact, as similar to what Suzette just mentioned. So I think it starts with location. You know, where are you investing and why are you investing and how are you interacting or operating? How are you interacting with the communities that you're in? Why are you there, and how are you benefiting not only yourself as an entrepreneur or investor, but also how are you benefiting the community and the residents and workers that live and work in those communities. One of the things I definitely want everybody to take away is their bottom line was mentioned. There does not have to be a sacrifice to achieving a triple bottom line in terms of your top line investor return. So I think it's very important to get that message out there, to get more investors who are committed to investing with social impact, but not sacrificing returns in order to do so. And you know, people understanding you don't have to sacrifice returns to have a positive social impact, particularly from my experience, I know in the residential sector. I'm sure it applies to life sciences as well and other industries. And I think that's a huge takeaway that folks can hopefully resonate with and understand, that the triple bottom line is achievable. And the more folks that are doing it, the more achievable it will be. And then to close out, I would say that having that at a firm level, having this social impact strategy as an investment strategy and as a focus for your company can definitely help you grow to be a stronger company, from everything that we talked about from the DE&I perspective. It also helps you separate yourself from other operators, other sponsors who don't have a focus on one of the ES or Gs, to kind of stand out in that community, as well as be a leader. And we definitely need more leaders, as we mentioned, that are focused on this, and that's what we're looking forward to seeing in the future.
Well, thank you both. This has been a great panel. I really loved how we covered everything from health and well-being to DEI and all of the different ways that you can make a social impact, and really kind of create a space where all the stakeholders can thrive. So thank you, Suzette. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of our participants and speakers today. Thank you for sharing your insights. That's been really great. And in particular, I would like to thank our sponsors for underwriting today's webinar. So thank you very much to Elion, GID, Hines, Mosser, and Sterling Bay. We will be sending around a video recording of today's webinar in the near future, which will be available to review. And I'd just like to say happy holidays and all the best for a wonderful 2023 from all of us here at IREI. Thank you.